Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a mystery the world was never supposed to solve. A pope chosen with hope in his heart. A man who smiled through storms, and then, without warning, vanished. 33 days after rising to the highest seat in the church, John Paul I was gone. No struggle, no witness, just silence. A silence so deep it swallowed answers before the questions were even asked. The Vatican called it a heart attack. But behind closed doors, records were sealed, timelines shifted, and the story kept changing. A doctor never summoned. A notebook gone missing. A body buried before the world could breathe. This isn't just about one man's death. It's about what he saw, what he planned to expose, and why so many wanted him quiet. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't argue. It erases. Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we follow the trail they tried to bury. And the silence speaks louder than words. They called him the Smiling Pope. But before the world ever saw that smile, before the white robes, the balcony, or the Vatican keys, he was just Albino. A quiet boy from the misty valleys of Belluno, where the mountains rise like silent sentinels and time moves slowly. There was no prophecy about him, no visions, no sacred signs. Only a child who walked barefoot to school and listened more than he spoke. And yet somehow, this quiet son of a bricklayer would rise to the most powerful seat in the Catholic Church, only to vanish 33 days later without a trace of truth. Albino Luciani was born in 1912, in a village so small it barely made it onto maps. His family was poor, not the romantic kind of poor that inspires statues and novels. The kind of poor where meals were thin, winters were long, and dreams had to be practical. His father worked in Switzerland, mixing mortar and carrying stone. His mother held the home together. Faith wasn't an escape for Albino. It was a rhythm, a way to make sense of a world that often didn't. From the start he was different. While other boys chased footballs through muddy fields, Albino asked questions about heaven, about sin, about why priests wore black. He wasn't trying to be holy. He just wanted to understand. The local priest noticed this curiosity and helped guide him into seminary school. It wasn't glamorous. There were no Vatican corridors or gold-leafed pages. Just long hours of Latin, worn textbooks, and prayers whispered before dawn. Albino didn't have the sharp political edge of some of his peers. He didn't charm with power. He charmed with kindness. His sermons were simple, his letters warm. He never tried to impress, and somehow that impressed everyone. As he moved up the church ladder, from parish priest to bishop, and eventually to Patriarch of Venice, he kept the same worn suitcase, the same soft voice, and the same wide-eyed awe toward the mysteries of God. People often say the church rewards ambition, but Luciani didn't climb. He floated upward, as if carried by something invisible. He refused the spotlight. He hated fancy clothes. When offered a luxurious bishop's ring, he chose one made of cheap metal. When asked about papal honours, he said he felt more like a schoolboy called into the headmaster's office than a future pope. And yet, the Vatican chose him. In 1978, after a tense conclave filled with uncertainty and rival factions, the cardinals turned to the man least likely to seek power. He took the name John Paul, a tribute to his two predecessors, and within moments, his smile spread across television screens and newspapers around the globe. The people adored him, not because of what he promised, but because of who he was. No one suspected that the clock had already started ticking. That behind the smile was a man walking unknowingly toward the edge of a mystery that would one day shake the foundations of the church itself. Albino Luciani had entered the Vatican, but it would never let him leave. In the 1970s, the Vatican wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a battlefield in disguise. Behind the grand marble columns and golden altars, something darker pulsed through its veins. The world outside was already in chaos. The Cold War divided nations like a cracked mirror. Spies traded secrets in shadows. Revolutions sparked in distant corners. And while the faithful came to St. Peter's Square to seek peace inside the walls of the Vatican, peace was the one thing no one could find. The church was at war with itself. On the surface, it preached unity and love. But inside the Curia, the powerful administrative body that ran the Vatican, there were secrets. Long-standing cardinals clashed with reformers. Traditionalists whispered about the dangers of modern thinking. Liberals called for change. Everyone smiled in public, but trust was rare. Every handshake hid a question. Every meeting felt like a test. Even the air in the Vatican seemed to hold its breath. The Second Vatican Council, held in the 1960s, had opened doors the church had kept closed for centuries. Suddenly, Mass was being said in local languages instead of Latin. Priests were encouraged to engage with the modern world. It was a moment of light, but not everyone liked it. The changes shook the old foundations, and by the 1970s, cracks began to spread. Some wanted to move forward. Others wanted to slam the door shut. And in the middle of this spiritual tug-of-war, another force began to rise. Money, power, and something more chilling, the whispers of Freemasonry. It started as a rumour, a strange list of names, Vatican insiders, bankers, bishops, all said to belong to a secret lodge known as Propaganda Do, or P2. This wasn't some old boys club. It was powerful, political, and deeply feared. Its members were connected to financial scandals, intelligence networks, and even mysterious deaths. And now, they were said to have reached inside the Vatican itself. At the heart of this web sat the Vatican Bank, officially called the Institute for the Works of Religion. But this bank didn't just hold donations and church funds. It moved millions across borders, often with little oversight. Strange deals were made. Mysterious figures like Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi handled the church's money. And behind them, always watching, was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a man known as the Pope's banker, who operated more like a Wall Street CEO than a servant of God. The Vatican had become a strange place. Half spiritual kingdom, half political fortress. Faith was still present, but so was fear. Inside its ancient walls, alliances formed and broke in silence. Files went missing, people were reassigned without warning, and some secrets were buried deeper than any grave. This was the world Albino Luciani stepped into, a smiling, soft-spoken priest, walking straight into a maze of power plays and ancient grudges. He believed he was entering the house of God. But what he found was something else. A Vatican not at peace, but on the edge of something no one dared to name. The smoke rose white over the Vatican on a warm August evening in 1978. Crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square, eyes lifted, hearts pounding. A new pope had been chosen. But no one could have guessed who it would be. Not the journalists, not the diplomats, not even the man who had just been elected. Inside the Sistine Chapel, behind locked doors and guarded walls, the conclave of cardinals had begun like many before it. Whispers filled the room. Old alliances stirred. Each cardinal carried not just prayer, but politics in his heart. They were choosing not only a pope, but a path. The church was in turmoil. Scandal whispered through its halls. Faithful Catholics were losing trust. The world wanted answers. The church needed a leader, and fast. Most bets were on powerful names. Cardinals who had built careers in Rome, who knew the system inside out. The ones who had networks, leverage, and long histories of navigating the church's inner storms. Albino Luciani was not one of them. He was the Patriarch of Venice, a quiet reformer, a man known for his warmth, his simple sermons, and his refusal to play the game. He didn't seek power, he didn't chase titles. He was loved by his flock, but overlooked by the powerful. Even as he boarded the train to Rome for the conclave, Luciani told a friend, "Don't worry, I won't be coming back as Pope." But something strange happened inside that chapel. The votes started to move, slowly at first, then with growing force. One by one, cardinals began to circle around the man who didn't want it, who hadn't prepared a campaign, who hadn't even brought the right clothes. Some say it was his humility that won them over. Others say it was desperation. The church needed a fresh face, a clean slate, a man untouched by the Vatican's darker undercurrents. By the fourth ballot, the votes were clear. Albino Luciani was chosen. The silence in the room was thick. He sat there stunned. When the question was asked, "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" his voice barely rose above a whisper. He accepted, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. He took the name John Paul, the first pope in history, to combine two names, a tribute to the two men who had gone before him, a symbol of unity in a divided church. When he stepped onto the balcony that evening, the crowd didn't know who he was. But when he smiled, something shifted. He waved shyly. He looked overwhelmed. There were no grand gestures, no theatrical blessings. Just a man, suddenly carrying the weight of 1 billion souls. And somewhere deep inside the Vatican, the game had changed. The humble priest had become pope. But not everyone was smiling. Not everyone had wanted this. And as the bells rang and the crowds cheered, a new chapter had begun, one filled with light. But already, shadows were beginning to gather. For 33 days, the Vatican felt different, lighter somehow, like the weight of centuries had shifted just a little. Pope John Paul I didn't command attention the way others had. He didn't stride into rooms or raise his voice. But something about him made people stop and listen. Maybe it was the way he smiled like he meant it, or the way he spoke in stories and jokes instead of sermons and commands. Whatever it was, the world noticed, and for a brief moment, it felt like the church was breathing new air. He refused the traditional papal coronation. No jeweled crown placed on his head. No grand procession with trumpets and gold. When offered the throne of Peter, he chose a simple chair. When dressed in royal vestments, he asked for something plainer. He said he didn't want to be carried on a platform above the people. He wanted to walk among them, not above, never above. Every move he made was a quiet rebellion, not loud or dramatic, just firm and full of heart. He cut down formalities, shortened speeches, spoke in a way people understood. When asked why he smiled so often, he said it was better than scolding. He joked that God was more merciful than people thought, and behind that humour was something rare, sincerity. Inside the Vatican, some were inspired, others were worried. Change makes power nervous. And John Paul I was not following the script. He spoke of cleaning up the church finances, of investigating the Vatican Bank, of making the church more open and less obsessed with hierarchy. He wanted to focus on love, on service, on the kind of faith that didn't require fear to survive. In private, he met with staff and cardinals, and listened more than he spoke. He wrote ideas in notebooks, reflected on teachings he thought needed rethinking. He believed the church had become too comfortable with power, too distant from the people it claimed to serve. He didn't want a throne, he wanted a table. The media loved him. The public adored him. Even those outside the faith were drawn to his presence. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he felt like someone real. A grandfatherly figure with kind eyes and a heart full of questions. But behind the scenes, not everyone was celebrating. Some Vatican insiders saw his simplicity as dangerous, his reforms as reckless, his curiosity as a threat. They didn't say it aloud, not yet. But the tension was growing. The walls of the apostolic palace were thick, but not thick enough to hide the worry or the whispers. Still, John Paul I kept smiling, kept working, kept believing that kindness could be stronger than tradition, that the church could remember its soul. And then, just like that, he was gone. No warning, no goodbye, only silence. 33 days, that was all he had. But in that short time, something had shifted. The light had changed, even if only for a moment. The world expected a show. A grand coronation with ancient rituals, velvet robes, and the weight of centuries placed on one man's head. But when Albino Luciani became Pope John Paul I, he quietly said no. No to the crown, no to the throne, no to the idea that a fisherman's successor needed gold to lead. It started right away. Tradition said the new pope should be carried through St. Peter's Basilica on a golden chair high above the crowd like a king. But Luciani didn't want to be lifted. He wanted to walk, just like Jesus did. The officials around him were stunned. Some argued, others pleaded. But he insisted, and instead of being paraded above the people, he entered simply, with his feet on the ground, already breaking rules. He refused the papal tiara, that heavy triple crown that once symbolized the Pope's earthly and heavenly power. Other popes had worn it with pride, but Luciani called it unnecessary. He said he didn't want to rule, he wanted to serve. The image of him refusing that crown sent shockwaves through the Vatican. It was small, symbolic, but symbols in the church carry weight, and he was lifting it off his shoulders. His clothes were just as telling. While others favoured rich fabrics and detailed embroidery, Luciani asked for something simpler. A plainer cassock, fewer decorations. Even his shoes were less ornate. He didn't want to stand out. He wanted to blend in. The palace tailors were confused. This was the Pope. Wasn't he supposed to look the part? But John Paul, I didn't care about looking like a pope. He cared about acting like one. Even his language changed. Instead of speaking in complex theological riddles, he spoke clearly, gently, with the warmth of a teacher rather than the formality of a ruler. He used stories, personal reflections, humour. He didn't lecture. He invited. For many Catholics, this was refreshing. For some in power, it was unsettling. Inside the Vatican walls, tradition was law. Change was slow. And suddenly, the most powerful man in the church was skipping steps centuries old. There was no grand coronation mass. No long list of titles read aloud. Just a modest installation and a quiet smile. People watched and wondered, was this the start of something new, or would the system push back? John Paul, I saw the role of Pope, not as a monarch, but as a shepherd. Someone to guide, not command. To listen, not dominate. His refusal of ceremony wasn't a rejection of the church. It was a reminder of what it was meant to be. Humble, grounded, close to the people. But not everyone liked what they were seeing. Some felt his simplicity was an insult to tradition. Others feared what might come next. Change makes the old guard nervous, especially when it comes from the top. Still he continued, unshaken, gentle but firm, the first pope in centuries to truly strip the role down to its bones. A papacy without ceremony, but full of meaning. The Vatican looks peaceful on the outside. Massive pillars, golden domes, statues of saints watching from above. But inside its walls, secrets moved like smoke. Not everyone was thrilled about the new pope's gentle ways. Not everyone saw his smile as a blessing. Some saw it as a warning, a sign that change was coming, and not the kind they wanted. John Paul I had stepped into something much bigger than he realized. Behind the velvet curtains and candlelit chapels was a world of silent power, the curia, the inner circle of the church. Cardinals and bishops, who had spent decades building influence. They knew how things worked, who to call, what to hide. They didn't like surprises, and John Paul I was full of them. He didn't play their game. He didn't ask permission. He spoke about reforming the Vatican Bank, about cleaning up corruption, about investigating strange money trails. That bank wasn't just about church donations. It was tied to businesses, banks, even intelligence agencies across borders. Men like Archbishop Marcinkus, who ran the Vatican's finances, weren't used to being questioned. And now they were. Whispers began to grow. Some said the Pope was going to expose a network of shadowy connections. Men in high places. Men who didn't wear cassocks but suits. Powerful businessmen linked to a secret group called Propaganda Due, or P2, an underground Masonic lodge operating in Italy. Its members included judges, politicians, and yes, even people inside the church. The church had long forbidden membership in Masonic groups. They were seen as secretive and unchristian. But the lines were blurring. P2 wasn't about religion. It was about influence. About pulling strings behind the scenes. And some of those strings were tied tightly around the Vatican's neck. Reports began to surface that certain bishops and clerics were on secret membership lists, names that were never supposed to be public. And John Paul I was rumoured to have seen one, or at least heard of it. A list of men connected to Masonic lodges, banking scandals, and internal Vatican affairs. If he had acted on it, he could have blown everything wide open. But that was the problem. He wanted to act. He wanted to make changes, fire people, restructure departments, shine light where darkness had settled, and for those in the shadows that made him dangerous. Not with fire or fury, not with rebellion, but with gentleness, with questions, with too much honesty. In any other place, a humble reformer might be cheered. But in the Vatican in 1978, a humble reformer could become a threat, especially when he started tugging on threads that were never meant to unravel. The Pope had only been in power a few weeks, but already alliances were shifting, eyes were watching, and the deeper he looked, the more uneasy the silence around him became. He smiled through it, but some smiles hide storms, and this one was just beginning. Money in the Vatican didn't always look holy. Behind the crosses and stained glass, there was another side to the church, one filled with balance sheets, offshore accounts, and handshakes in dark rooms. At the centre of it all was the Vatican Bank. Officially, it was called the Institute for the Works of Religion, but what it did went far beyond charity or mission work. It moved money, a lot of it, and not always in ways that were easy to explain. In the 1970s, the Vatican Bank was tied closely to Banco Ambrosiano, one of the largest private banks in Italy. On the surface, they were just business partners. But behind the scenes, the lines were messy and dangerous. Banco Ambrosiano was run by a man named Roberto Calvi. He was called God's banker because of his deep ties to the church, but he wasn't exactly a saint. Calvi's bank was involved in shady deals, loans that disappeared, and offshore companies that seemed to exist only on paper. Billions of dollars were moving in strange circles, some of it linked to arms deals, some possibly to criminal networks, and in the middle of this web sat the Vatican Bank. One of the key figures connecting it all was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian banker with close ties to the mafia and the Vatican. He was slick, charming, and ruthless. At first, he was seen as a financial genius. He even advised popes on money matters. But later investigations revealed he was laundering drug money and covering losses through fraud. Sindona and Calvi weren't just bad apples. They were part of a system that blurred the line between faith and finance, between God and greed. And when John Paul I became Pope, he started asking questions. Too many questions. He wanted transparency. He wanted names. He wanted to know why the Vatican was tied to banks accused of fraud and organised crime. Some say he was preparing to remove key players in the Vatican Bank, including Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who had protected Calvi and Sindona for years. That alone would have shaken the Vatican's walls. Marcinkus had powerful friends, both inside and outside the church. In 1982, just a few years after John Paul I's death, Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with bricks. His death was ruled a murder. Sindona died too, poisoned while in prison. Officially, it was cyanide in his coffee. Unofficially, it was a warning. But back in 1978, these endings were still in the future. What mattered was that the Pope was starting to pull at threads that led to all of it. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't issue threats. He just asked to see the books. And sometimes, in places built on silence and control, that's the most dangerous move of all. Because when money and power mix with faith, the truth doesn't just set people free. Sometimes it disappears them. Late at night, while most of the Vatican slept, quiet footsteps echoed through the marble halls. Lamps flickered low, casting long shadows on ancient walls. And behind certain doors, whispered voices met in secret. These weren't the grand meetings with cameras and choirs. These were private, unscheduled, and according to rumours, they were dangerous. John Paul I. I wasn't a man who enjoyed drama, but he was a man who listened. And as the days of his short papacy ticked by, he began calling certain people into his chambers: cardinals, secretaries, financial advisors, even members of the Curia he didn't fully trust. He asked quiet questions, listened carefully, took notes, and always in private, away from the official Vatican channels. Some said he met with men who brought him files, evidence, names. Others said he received warnings, that there were forces working against him, that he should slow down, stay quiet, smile for the crowds, and leave the deep cleaning to someone else. But that wasn't his way. He believed the church needed honesty, even if it hurt. There's talk of one night in particular, just days before his death, a meeting that lasted hours. No one knows exactly who was there. The names shift with each telling. But the phrase that keeps coming back is the same. He said he was going to clean house, that certain men would be removed. That change was not coming someday, it was coming now. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about secrecy, about a system that had protected itself for too long. And here was a pope saying, the silence was over, that light was coming. Some were inspired, others terrified. One cardinal later recalled seeing a list on the Pope's desk, a list of officials under investigation, men tied to banking scandals and possible Masonic links. The Pope was reportedly preparing to act. Letters of resignation were to be requested. Some say he even drafted them himself, ready to deliver within the week. But those letters were never sent. The night meetings stopped when he died. There's also the mystery of the smiling secretary. One of the Pope's close aides said he seemed more determined than ever in those final days. Calm, clear, focused, not frightened, not sick. Just ready. As if he knew the clock was ticking but didn't plan to stop. Others weren't so calm. The mood around him had shifted. Doors closed a little faster. Conversations paused when he entered. He was surrounded by ritual and tradition, but the air had grown sharp, and he could feel it. Still he pressed forward. He didn't announce his plans to the world, but those behind closed doors knew what he intended, and some of them didn't want it to happen. The Vatican is built on secrets, but secrets don't stay buried forever, especially not when someone dares to dig. And John Paul I was digging, quietly, carefully, late at night, just before the silence fell for good. Some popes leave behind papal bulls or grand declarations. John Paul I left behind something far smaller, a notebook, just a small black book kept close to his bedside. Plain cover, no title. But inside it may have held the most dangerous secrets in the Vatican. Not prophecies or prayers, but names, real names. Those close to him said he used it like a journal, a place to record his thoughts, reflections, and plans. He had always been a quiet thinker, not the kind to shout his ideas in public. He preferred pen and paper, and in those last days the entries became sharper, more focused, like a man trying to draw a map through a maze before time ran out. Inside that notebook, according to some who claimed to see it, was a list, a short one, but each name was important. Cardinals, bishops, key members of the Vatican's internal power structure. These weren't just random names. They were men tied to ongoing scandals, shady financial dealings, or secret associations. Men whose influence ran deep. Men who were almost untouchable, but not to him. He reportedly marked them for removal, not as punishment, but as cleansing. He believed the church couldn't speak of truth while rotting inside, that the poison had to be cut out. And this list was the scalpel. Some names are rumoured to have appeared again and again in whispered conversations long after his death. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, connected to the Ambrosiano scandal, protected for years. Cardinal Sebastiano Baggio, another powerful figure accused of shielding corrupt clergy, and others more hidden names, whose stories remain half buried in Vatican silence. The Pope never announced his intentions publicly, but insiders say the notebook revealed them clearly. There were signs he was about to act. Meetings had been scheduled, memos drafted. Some believe that within days of his death, letters of dismissal would have been delivered. The kind of letters that shake institutions to the core. But then he died, and the notebook vanished. The Vatican never officially confirmed its contents. Some said it was turned over to his successor. Others believed it was destroyed, hidden to protect the church's image. A few even claimed copies were made before it disappeared, passed quietly from hand to hand, proof of what he knew, and what he was about to do. If true, the Black Book wasn't just a diary, it was a plan. A roadmap to reform written by a man who believed the church could still save itself if it dared to look inward. But in a place built on hierarchy, tradition, and quiet deals, that kind of honesty was dangerous. He didn't shout accusations. He didn't stir rebellion. He just picked up a pen, wrote down the names, and began preparing to turn the page. But someone else closed the book first. He smiled like everything was fine, like the world was gentle and full of hope. That's what people remember most about Pope John Paul I. The warm eyes, the humble wave, that soft smile that seemed to say, it's going to be okay. But behind that smile was something heavier, something he didn't show on balconies or in interviews. A weight that only grew heavier the longer he sat on the throne of St. Peter. He wasn't naive. He knew the church was in trouble. Not just because of bad press or scandals, but because something deeper was cracking beneath the surface. He felt it, in the gold-plated rooms, in the stiff silence of meetings, in the way some men avoided eye contact when certain topics came up. To the world he looked like a breath of fresh air, a humble pope, a reformer. But in private he was worried, very worried. He saw things that disturbed him, layers of secrecy, men clinging to power not for faith but for control, financial systems that didn't add up, hierarchies built to protect positions, not people, and beneath it all a spiritual rot, a sense that the church had become more about survival than salvation. He talked about it with those he trusted, few and far between. He would speak softly in his study or in quiet corners of the Vatican gardens. He asked questions most popes didn't dare ask. Why were certain men protected? Why were funds disappearing? Why were faithful voices being silenced while political ones were promoted? He didn't accuse, he didn't rage. That wasn't his way. But he noticed, and the more he noticed, the more troubled he became. Even his sermons changed. Beneath the joyful tone, there were warnings. Little lines about honesty, about returning to the roots of the gospel, about the danger of pride and hidden sin. Most people heard kindness, but those watching closely heard something else. A call to clean the temple, a quiet alarm. His smile never faded, not in public, but behind closed doors, the worry was clear. His letters grew more urgent, his eyes sometimes tired. He was a man who knew something was wrong, and he was trying to fix it from the inside. Maybe that's why the smile mattered so much. Not because it was fake, but because it was defiant. A choice to show hope even when he was surrounded by shadows. A way of saying, I see what you've done, but I still believe we can do better. The smile wasn't weakness, it was strength. The kind that doesn't shout, that doesn't fight back with fists, but keeps showing up, keeps pushing forward, even when the walls are closing in. And maybe that's what scared them most, not his reforms, not his plans, but the quiet power of a man who saw the worst in the church and still believed in its best, and smiled anyway. The papal apartments were grand but cold, thick marble walls, tall ceilings, silence that seemed to stretch for miles, and inside them sat a man who had once walked dusty roads as a small-town priest. Now he wore white robes. Now they called him Holy Father. But in those final days, Pope John Paul I was more alone than ever. At first, there was excitement. He was new, gentle, different. People smiled when he passed. Reporters called him the smiling Pope. But inside the Vatican, things were shifting. Not everyone liked change, especially not the kind that threatened power. And the more he tried to open windows, the more doors began to close. Meetings that once felt warm became stiff. Some advisors stopped offering advice altogether. Others became overly formal, careful with their words, as if watching him, not supporting him. The ones who shared his vision for reform were few, and even they were careful not to stand too close. He would eat meals mostly alone, walk the halls mostly alone, pray in his private chapel sometimes for hours. The guards outside his door stayed silent. His secretaries kept their heads down. There were moments when it felt like the walls themselves were listening. This wasn't just shyness, it was distance, calculated distance, as if those around him sensed what was coming, or maybe feared getting pulled into it. He wasn't being shouted at or threatened. The danger wasn't loud, it was quiet, the kind that comes in silence. Letters went unanswered, notes disappeared, requests were delayed. It was as if someone had started pulling threads from beneath him, slowly, gently, but with purpose. He had plans to meet with certain officials. Those meetings were rescheduled. He had questions about church finances. The files arrived late, or not at all. One evening, he was seen standing alone on a Vatican balcony, staring out at the darkened city. A priest, walking by, said he looked tired, not physically, but spiritually, like a man carrying something too heavy for one pair of hands. Some believe he knew, that he felt the danger, but he never let it change him. He kept smiling, kept working, kept writing notes, late into the night, but the sense of isolation grew. Not just loneliness, but abandonment. A pope, surrounded by people, yet standing completely alone. Even the air in the apartments changed. Cold drafts, quiet echoes, long nights where footsteps seemed louder than usual. He was the most powerful man in the church. And yet, in those final days, he seemed like the only one without a shield. A pope is never truly alone, they say, but John Paul I was. Not because he pushed people away, but because he had stepped into something few dared touch. A place where truth was dangerous and silence had teeth. And in the end, all he had was his notebook, his prayers, and a world that had suddenly gone very, very quiet. September 28, 1978, started like any other day for Pope John Paul I. He rose early as usual before sunrise and spent time in quiet prayer. The Vatican was just beginning to stir. Bells chimed in the distance. Guards changed shifts. Secretaries shuffled papers down long halls. But inside the papal apartments, everything moved slowly, calmly, almost too calmly. He ate a light breakfast alone. Coffee, some bread, a bit of fruit, nothing heavy. That was his way. He preferred simple things. Even after becoming pope, he had refused fancy meals or lavish dishes. He just wanted to get to work. His morning was filled with meetings. Some brief, some longer. A few conversations were said to be private. Just him and a trusted aide or visitor. A cardinal remembered the Pope asking deep questions that morning. About reform, about faith, about courage. But no one knew what it meant at the time. It just sounded like a man thinking ahead, planning something. He wrote letters in the afternoon. Some of them were to bishops, some were personal. One was said to be about resignations, but that letter vanished, never confirmed, never found. Still, people remember his handwriting that day. Focused, sharp, like he was racing the clock without saying so. His last meal was simple too, soup and a bit of salad. He ate in silence, then walked briefly in the Vatican gardens. The sun was starting to set. Long shadows crawled up the walls. A few priests passed him on the path and said he looked peaceful, but there was something else behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, something quieter, heavier. He made a few more calls after dinner, nothing out of the ordinary. but those who spoke with him said he seemed more reflective than usual, not tired, just still, like he was holding something inside. By nightfall, he returned to his study. The windows were shut, the air was still. He picked up his pen one last time and jotted down a few notes. Scriptures, ideas for a sermon, nothing dramatic, just words. But that notebook would become one of the most mysterious objects in Vatican history. His final conversation was with Sister Vincenza. She brought him a glass of water and some papers. He thanked her kindly as always and told her not to worry, that everything would be fine. She said he looked calm, peaceful, almost glowing, and that was the last anyone saw him alive. No alarms were raised, no signs of struggle, just quiet, a silence that fell like a curtain as the Vatican lights dimmed. It was just another day, until it wasn't. The morning light slipped quietly through the shutters of the papal apartment. Rome was waking up. Bells echoed faintly across the Vatican grounds. It was just before 5:00 a.m. when Sister Vincenza made her way down the familiar hallway. She had done this many times before. Bring the Holy Father his morning tea. Leave it quietly, no need to knock. He was always awake by then. She carried the tray with careful hands. The air felt still. Too still. No soft creak of floorboards. No rustle of pages. Just silence. When she opened the door to his room, she expected to see him in his chair, or already dressed, smiling gently like always. But what she saw froze her in place. He was still in bed, lying slightly tilted. His reading glasses were resting on his nose. A few papers and a small book lay on his chest. His hands were calm. No sign of pain or panic, just stillness. A strange, peaceful stillness that didn't feel right. She whispered his name. Nothing. She stepped closer and gently touched his shoulder. Still nothing. That's when it hit her. Pope John Paul I was gone. There was no struggle, no mess, no drama. Just a man who looked like he had fallen asleep while reading and never woken up. But Sister Vincenza knew something felt wrong. The tea was still warm in her hands, but the room felt cold. Not from the air, from the silence. She backed away slowly and called for help. Within minutes, the apartment filled with movement. Cardinals, staff, guards, doctors, but nothing changed. They checked his pulse, checked his breathing. There was nothing left to do. He had died in the night. Word began to spread through the Vatican like a chill wind. Priests stopped mid-prayer. Phones rang in rapid bursts. Some wept. Some stood in stunned silence. But in those first hours, only a few people knew. The rest of the world wouldn't be told until later that morning. Sister Vincenza remained close by. She had known him for years, not just as Pope, but as a bishop, as a friend. She had seen the weight he carried those last few days. She had watched the smile fade just a little each evening. And now, here he was, gone without a goodbye. People would ask questions for years about how he was found, about what he was reading, about why the Vatican delayed the announcement. But for Sister Vincenza, that moment stayed frozen in time. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so quiet. The man who had tried to bring light into shadows had died in the dark. No cries, no warnings, just a soft silence and a cup of tea that never got delivered. The world didn't hear about the Pope's death until hours after Sister Vincenza found him. By then the sun was already high over Rome, and the Vatican was buzzing behind locked gates. Reporters were outside waiting for answers, but inside, something strange was happening. The kind of strange that doesn't shout. It whispers, moves quickly, leaves no fingerprints. The official statement said Pope John Paul I died of a heart attack during the night, peacefully, quietly, but almost immediately people noticed things that didn't add up. The timeline kept shifting. First they said he was found at 5:30 a.m., then 4:30. Then someone said maybe earlier. The details were foggy, even though everything should have been clear. It was the Pope. In the Vatican, how could anything be unclear? But it got weirder. There was no autopsy. None. Not even a basic one. In most cases, even the death of a bishop would include a medical exam. But this was the Pope. And yet within hours, they had already decided there would be no investigation, no deeper look. The reason? They said it was against Vatican tradition to perform autopsies on popes. But that wasn't exactly true. In fact, popes in the past had been examined when something seemed off. This time, they didn't even ask. Instead, they moved fast. Too fast. The body was embalmed that very day, before sunset, which was highly unusual. Normally there's a waiting period, time for family, time for ceremony. But here, everything happened almost like they were racing the clock. Like they didn't want certain things to be noticed, or tested, or found. Even the people inside the Vatican were confused. Secretaries gave different accounts. Some said he was reading when he died. Others said the papers on his chest were gone by the time they entered the room. One mentioned a note clutched in his hand. Another said there was no note at all. It was like the truth had been sliced into pieces and passed around in whispers. When the press finally heard the news, they were shocked. Not just by the death, but by the way it was handled. Reporters began asking questions. Why no autopsy? Why embalm so quickly? Who found the Pope? At first, the Vatican said it was a priest. Then they changed the story. It was a nun. Then another version emerged. Maybe both. The confusion only grew. People weren't just mourning anymore. They were suspicious. Because something was missing. Not just clarity, not just answers, but trust. The kind of trust people expect from the Church, from the Vatican, from the men who lead it. And in that silence, in those shifting timelines, something darker began to take root. A question that refused to go away. What were they trying to hide? The Vatican said it was a heart attack. That Pope John Paul I died peacefully in his sleep sometime during the night. No signs of struggle, no pain. Just a sudden quiet end. But the more people looked at that explanation, the more it began to crack. First there was his health. By all reports, he was fine. Not perfect maybe, but not sick either. In fact, just days before he had joked about how good he felt. He walked daily, ate lightly, didn't smoke or drink. He didn't take heavy medications. His personal doctor never raised any alarms. And if he really had been at risk, wouldn't the Vatican have kept a closer medical watch on him? But they didn't, because no one expected him to die. Not like that, not so soon. Then came the strangest part of all. No doctor ever saw the body before it was moved. When Sister Vincenza found him and raised the alarm, the room filled with clergy, a few assistants, some guards, but no physician, not immediately. The Vatican doctor was reportedly called later, but by then things had already been decided. They said there was no need to examine him closely, that it was clear he had passed from natural causes. But how could they be sure, without a proper check, without time to even consider the alternatives? And just like that, the idea of a heart attack became the official story, locked in place. Even though no tests were done, no medical report was made public, no second opinion was invited. The most powerful spiritual leader in the world had died suddenly and not a single independent doctor had been allowed to confirm it. And then came the embalmers, rushed in before sunset. They were ordered to begin the process right away, even though the body should have remained untouched for a proper inspection, even though in most countries that would have been illegal. Here, it was simply declared tradition, a vague rule no one could really confirm, and once embalming began, all possibility of discovering the real cause of death vanished forever. There were rumours too, quiet ones, that maybe the Pope had complained about something the day before, that he had received a strange message, that he had felt uneasy, but none of it could be proven, because the one person who could explain what really happened was gone, and the Vatican made sure there would be no second look. People began to wonder, if it truly was a heart attack, why not be transparent? Why not show the records? Why silence the questions? It wasn't just about the Pope anymore. It was about trust, about the feeling that something had been hidden, buried, locked away, and the world was left to wonder not just how he died, but if someone made sure he did. When the Vatican finally announced that Pope John Paul I had died, people expected sadness. What they didn't expect was confusion, not just about the cause of death, but about something even more basic. Who found him? At first the story was simple. A nun brought in his tea that morning and found him still sitting in bed, but then that version started to change. Not once, not twice, several times. The first official account said it was a priest, one of his secretaries. He went to check on the Pope and discovered he had passed away. But within hours, that story shifted. Now, it wasn't the priest. It was Sister Vincenza. She had entered the room early in the morning to deliver his tea and saw that he wasn't moving. His reading glasses were still on his nose, his face peaceful, the book resting on his chest. Then, yet another version appeared. Some Vatican officials said that both the nun and the priest found him together. Others claimed the priest entered first and then called the nun. But Sister Vincenza herself had quietly told others that she was the one who walked in alone. She was the first to see him. She had seen him every morning. It was part of her daily routine. She didn't need to be called. Each version was different, and instead of clearing things up, it made people suspicious. Why couldn't they get the story straight? It wasn't a small detail. It was the moment the Pope was discovered dead. If something that important could be mixed up, what else were they hiding? And it didn't stop there. Some said the Pope had a note in his hand when he was found. Others said there was no note at all. A few reports claimed his face looked calm. Others hinted there might have been signs of discomfort. The time of discovery was also unclear. Was it 4:30 a.m. or closer to 5:00? Why did different officials give different answers? It was as if the Vatican couldn't decide what story to settle on, and the more they changed it, the more people started to wonder if it was ever true to begin with. In any other place, this might have caused an investigation. Questions, a search for facts. But in the Vatican, the doors stayed closed, the answers stayed locked, and the contradictions were treated like minor mistakes. But they weren't minor, because behind every change in the story was a deeper silence, a refusal to explain why things didn't line up, and that silence began to echo louder than the official statements. People weren't just asking who found the Pope. They were asking why no one seemed to know for sure. Or worse, why some people seemed to know and weren't telling. Dr. Renato Busonetti was the Pope's personal physician. He had been appointed to look after the health of the most important man in the Catholic Church. But when Pope John Paul I was found dead, on that quiet September morning, something strange happened. The doctor was not there, and even stranger, he wasn't allowed to be. The news spread quickly through the papal apartments. The Pope had died during the night, but when Dr. Buzzanetti arrived, he wasn't immediately brought in to examine the body. In fact, according to multiple accounts, he wasn't let into the bedroom at all, at least not right away. And by the time he finally saw the Pope, there was nothing left for him to do. No examination. No chance to confirm the cause of death. Just a body already declared gone, already being prepared for embalming. Why wasn't the doctor called sooner? That question never got a clear answer. In most cases, the first step when someone dies unexpectedly is to call a physician, especially if that person is the Pope. But in this case, there was a pause, a gap, time that was unaccounted for. Some insiders later said there were orders given, quiet ones, that no medical inspection was needed, that it was already decided. The Pope had died of a heart attack. No need to question it. But who made that call? Not the doctor. Not the man trained to make those decisions. It's been said that Dr. Buzzanetti was frustrated, that he knew protocol had not been followed, that he had been pushed aside during the most critical moment of his role, but he never said much publicly. Just a few brief statements, careful words, no accusations, because in the Vatican you don't speak freely, especially not when things start to look suspicious. And they did look suspicious, because if the Pope had truly died of natural causes, wouldn't the Vatican want to prove it? Wouldn't they want their own physician to say so? Instead, they kept the doctor out of the room, made decisions without him, rushed through the next steps without a proper exam. It was almost as if they didn't want him to see something, or say something. And once the embalming began, all the truth was sealed away. No more questions, no more chances to check what really happened. People outside the Vatican started to notice. Reporters began asking why the papal doctor hadn't confirmed the cause of death, why there was no medical report, no signature from the man assigned to protect the Pope's health. There were no good answers, just silence. And in that silence, the mystery deepened. A Pope was dead, his doctor was kept away, and the truth was buried not just beneath stone and ceremony, but beneath the one thing no one could explain. An empty chair where the doctor should have been. The whispers started almost immediately. Long before the funeral. Long before the public had time to process what had really happened. Some said it was just gossip. Others said it was the only explanation that made sense, because something about Pope John Paul I's death didn't add up. And the most chilling rumour of all was that he had been poisoned. At the centre of the theory was a plant, a deadly one, digitalis, also known as foxglove, a beautiful flower that can stop a heart in just the right dose. In medicine, it's used carefully to treat heart conditions, but in the wrong hands, it becomes something else entirely. Quiet, quick, almost impossible to detect once the body is embalmed. And that's exactly what happened. The Pope was embalmed within hours, before any test could be done. No autopsy, no blood work, nothing. There were stories that he had been given medicine the night before, something for blood pressure, maybe a sleeping aid, but the bottles were never shown to the public. Some even claimed they went missing, that they had been removed from his bedside table before anyone else could see them. And once again the questions piled up. Why would someone poison the Pope? The answers pointed in every direction. His plans for reform had made him enemies. He was asking too many questions. Looking into the Vatican bank, talking about removing powerful men, people who had deep connections, people who didn't want change. Some of those names reportedly ended up in his private notebook, a list of people he was planning to reassign or confront. And that list may have been the most dangerous thing he ever wrote. There were whispers from inside Rome, from journalists, from clergy, from people who spoke only off the record, that a decision had been made, that the Pope was a threat, not because of what he had done, but because of what he was about to do. One more week, and he would have acted. One more week, and the secrets would have started to spill out. But he didn't get that week. He went to bed. He never woke up. Some said he looked too peaceful. Others noticed how quickly the Vatican shut the door on questions. It was as if they didn't want anyone thinking too hard. They repeated the phrase over and over. Natural causes. Natural causes. But not everyone believed it. And those who didn't began to look deeper. They found patterns. Past cases of poisoning. Old intelligence files. Connections between banking scandals and powerful groups with everything to lose. They didn't find proof, but they found something else. Fear. The kind of fear that keeps people quiet. Even today the theory remains. No autopsy, no doctor at the scene, no records of what medicine he took. Just a sudden death in the dark, and a wave of silence that followed it. And somewhere inside that silence, a secret waiting to be named. When Pope John Paul I was found dead in his bed, the world lost a gentle soul. But inside the Vatican, something else went missing that night. Documents. Papers that only he had seen. Notes he had written by hand. A list that was said to hold names of men he no longer trusted. And just like that, they were gone. It started with his private notebook. He had been writing in it every day since becoming Pope. Observations, concerns, plans for change. He was known for his neat handwriting and quiet reflection. Every evening, he would jot down thoughts. Things that disturbed him. Things he wanted to fix. People he wanted to confront. One of those pages reportedly contained a list. A blacklist. Men suspected of having ties to Freemasonry, something strictly forbidden inside the church. And that list was believed to include senior members of the Vatican hierarchy. But when the room was searched after his death, the notebook wasn't there, nor were several letters he had drafted. Letters addressed to powerful cardinals, letters challenging the financial dealings of the Vatican Bank, letters that called for resignations. They had not yet been delivered, but they were ready. Some said they were sitting on his desk the night before. Others said they were tucked into his Bible, but no one ever saw them again. Vatican officials claimed everything had been accounted for, that there was nothing suspicious. But no inventory was ever released. No one outside the tight circle of papal aides was allowed to see the papers, and the few people who did handle them in those hours never spoke openly. The only thing that remained was silence. And questions. Where did the documents go? If the Pope had written a list of names connected to secret societies, why wouldn't the Church want to investigate it? If he had outlined reforms that could clean up corruption, why weren't they shared with the cardinals? Some believe the answer is simple. Those papers were too dangerous. They named people in power. They threatened alliances. They exposed secrets that had been buried for decades. If released, they could have started a war inside the church itself. So they were taken, removed before sunrise, hidden or destroyed. There were whispers that one secretary had made copies, that those copies were smuggled out of the Vatican, but no one ever produced them. Only a few journalists claimed to have seen fragments, names scribbled in Latin, references to accounts, hidden networks, but the truth is no one really knows what was in those missing pages. Only that they were there, and then they weren't, just like the man who wrote them. Gone overnight. What remains are gaps, holes in the timeline, silence where words once were, a paper trail that led to fire, and a story written in ink that never got to leave the room. In every great mystery, there are names that keep coming up. People close to the centre, people with power. In the case of Pope John Paul I's sudden death, 3 names stand out like shadows in candlelight. Cardinal Jean-Marie Villot, Cardinal Giovanni Benelli, and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Each played a different role. Each had influence few could match, and each may have had something to lose if the Pope had lived just a little longer. Cardinal Villot was the Secretary of State, which basically made him the Vatican's second in command. He controlled information, controlled access. If you wanted to speak to the Pope, you often had to go through Villot first. When John Paul I died, it was Villot who entered the papal bedroom, Villot who made the first phone calls, Villot who began removing personal items from the room, including the Pope's glasses and slippers. He also removed the medicine on the nightstand. That might not sound like much, but later on, when people asked for an investigation, those details mattered. Why was Villot cleaning the room before the doctor even arrived? Why was he so quick to make decisions on his own? Then there was Cardinal Benelli, a long-time Vatican insider, and a man with sharp instincts. Some say he was the one who helped get Luciani elected. He believed in reform, in transparency. But as soon as the Pope died, Benelli's behaviour became strange. He wanted a fast funeral, no delays. He pushed to elect a new Pope as quickly as possible. Some believed he feared what might come out if the situation dragged on. Others thought he was trying to protect the Church. Either way, his fingerprints were all over the next chapter of Vatican history, especially in how fast the door was shut on any questions. And then there was Marcinkus. He wasn't a cardinal, but he was more powerful than most of them. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus ran the Vatican Bank, a former bodyguard with a commanding presence. He had deep ties to Italian financiers like Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi, men later exposed for laundering money and running illegal schemes. Marcinkus had kept them close, let them handle Vatican funds, and when John Paul I started looking into those dealings, Marcinkus suddenly had a reason to worry. The Pope was asking questions, quiet ones, but the kind that led to audits and possibly arrests. Marcinkus was protected, shielded by Vatican laws, but not from a Pope who wanted change. That made things dangerous. Some say these 3 men didn't work together, that they each had their own agenda, that Villot was a gatekeeper, Benelli a politician, Marcinkus a banker in a collar, but together they formed a wall, a shield around the old system, a system that John Paul I was trying to dismantle one meeting at a time. He didn't get the chance, and when he was gone, those 3 remained, powerful, quiet, and untouched. It happened faster than anyone expected. One day, the Pope was alive, smiling from balconies, waving to crowds, whispering words of reform behind closed doors. The next, he was gone. And before the shock could even settle, he was in the ground, buried under the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica, while the world was still trying to understand what had happened. John Paul I's funeral was rushed. There's no other way to put it. Within hours of his death, preparations had already started. No autopsy, no outside investigation. Just a tight schedule and quiet orders from behind the Vatican walls. Officials said they were following protocol. That papal tradition called for a quick burial. But even seasoned Vatican watchers raised their eyebrows. This was not just a pope. This was a pope who had served only 33 days. A pope who had no history of illness. A pope who had been full of energy the day before. Why not wait? Why not give people time to ask questions? Instead, it felt like the doors were closing. Fast. They embalmed him almost immediately. Strange, considering there had been no confirmation of the cause of death. Stranger still was the fact that no doctor had officially examined the body. When they finally announced the funeral, the Vatican gave journalists only the most basic information. Times, dates, nothing else. No details about the night he died. No timeline. No explanation for why his own personal physician had not been allowed to see him. And when the time came to place him in his coffin, there were rumours that the usual preparations were skipped, that he was buried without the traditional death mask, that his body had already begun to show signs of something unusual, but no one could prove it, because by then he was gone, locked away forever in the dark stone vault beneath the church. With him went more than a life. There were his notes, his questions, his concerns about the Vatican Bank, his plans to remove powerful figures from office, all of it buried in silence. And the men he had quietly opposed were the same ones arranging his funeral, the same ones who now stood to benefit from his absence. People talk about justice, about truth, but truth needs time, and in this case there was no time given, just ritual, just formality, just the sound of choirs and incense, while the most mysterious death in modern church history was lowered into the earth. No one was allowed to look deeper. No one was encouraged to ask. And maybe that was the point. Because questions are dangerous when they point at power. And when you bury a man before the questions can be asked, you bury more than a body. You bury the truth with him. At first, the press did what the press always does. They asked questions. They called sources. They showed up at the Vatican gates with microphones and cameras ready. The death of Pope John Paul I had shocked the world. A healthy pope gone in the middle of the night after just 33 days in office. Something didn't feel right, and journalists could sense it. But then the silence started. It began with soft warnings. Reporters who were told by editors to back off. That maybe this wasn't the story to chase. Some journalists received strange phone calls. Untraceable voices on the other end, asking them what they were looking for, or telling them what they shouldn't be. A few were pulled off the story entirely, told to cover something else, something safer. Inside Italy, the pressure was worse. Journalists from Rome said they felt watched, not by the church directly, but by people close to it. Sources suddenly refused to speak. Interview requests were denied. One Vatican insider, who had been willing to talk, changed his mind overnight, said he feared for his family, that whatever was going on was bigger than anyone realized. Television programs that had planned to run investigations suddenly cancelled their segments. Newspapers published vague obituaries full of praise and prayers, but left out the growing list of strange details. No autopsy. No doctor at the scene. Conflicting stories from Vatican officials. It was all there, waiting to be told. But it wasn't. Even international journalists ran into walls. Some American networks sent crews to Rome, but came back with very little. What they filmed was a funeral. What they wanted was the truth. But the closer they got to it, the quieter everything became. People weren't just afraid to talk, they were being told not to. One reporter later claimed that his hotel room had been searched. Nothing stolen, just disturbed, as if someone wanted him to know they had been there. Another said he received a handwritten note slipped under his door. It simply read, "Stop digging." And so most of them did. Not because they didn't care, but because they had no choice. The story faded. Other news took over. The Vatican moved on. A new pope was elected. The world watched as the page was turned. And for many in the press, the message had been made very clear. This was not a mystery to be solved. This was a page to be turned quickly and quietly. But some didn't forget. Some still whispered. Because when journalists are silenced not by facts, but by fear, you have to ask, what truth is so dangerous that it can't be spoken out loud? The morning after Pope John Paul I was found dead, something strange happened behind the Vatican walls. Not in the chapel, not in the papal apartments, but inside the offices of the Vatican Bank. Quiet doors closed, files were sealed, access was suddenly restricted. Only a few high-ranking officials were allowed inside. It was as if a switch had been flipped. One moment things were normal. The next, they were on lockdown. At first, no one really noticed. The focus was still on the Pope's death, on the shock, on the funeral. But deep inside the financial departments, a different kind of panic was taking place. People were shredding documents, replacing locks, moving money, and they were doing it fast. Because they knew something the rest of the world didn't. They knew what John Paul I had planned. Before his sudden death, the Pope had quietly begun looking into the Vatican's finances. He had asked questions, demanded clarity. He was especially interested in the Vatican's relationship with Banco Ambrosiano, a bank that was supposed to be clean, but had ties to some of the most powerful and corrupt figures in Italy. People like Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona, men connected not just to money laundering, but to organised crime. Men who did not like being watched. And John Paul I had been watching. He wanted reforms, transparency, a cleaning of the house. But before he could act, he was gone. And almost instantly, the Vatican Bank closed itself off. Whatever files the Pope had seen were removed. Whatever letters he had written vanished. It was as if his curiosity had never existed. Outside the Vatican, Banco Ambrosiano moved fast too. The bank began transferring funds, shifting accounts, covering trails. Calvi, the chairman known in the press as God's banker, was suddenly harder to reach. He stopped making public appearances. Some insiders said he looked nervous, paranoid, like he knew a clock had been ticking and now it had stopped. There were whispers that certain payments had been made to silence people, that hush money flowed through the same channels the Pope had tried to trace. But by then the trail was cold, the records were locked, and the one man who might have blown it all open was already buried beneath stone and silence. No one inside the Vatican would talk, no one outside could prove anything, and the press found themselves chasing ghosts. Because financial trails disappear quickly when people are paid to make them vanish. The Vatican Bank would later face massive scandal. Banco Ambrosiano would collapse. Calvi would be found hanging under a London bridge. Sindona would die in prison after drinking poisoned coffee. But all of that came later. Right now, all anyone saw was a closed door, a sealed vault, a silence too deep to be normal. And if the Pope had really planned to expose something, someone made sure he never got the chance. They wore the same robes, they spoke the same prayers. But after the death of John Paul I, the Vatican was no longer united. Something invisible had cracked. It wasn't just grief, it was something colder, sharper, a shift in the air that only those on the inside could feel, a kind of fear that wrapped itself around marble pillars and whispered through candlelit corridors. Some priests walked more carefully now, their voices lower, their footsteps slower. They didn't talk about the Pope's death, not directly, but in glances, in unfinished sentences. In the way their eyes lingered too long on locked doors, everyone could feel it, that something had happened, and not everyone agreed on what to do next. There were those who believed the Pope had been taken too soon by natural causes, that it was God's will, a tragic end to a humble reign. But even they seemed uncertain, like they wanted to believe it, but couldn't quite swallow the timeline the Church had offered. No autopsy, no doctor, just a quiet funeral and an even quieter explanation. Then there were others, the ones who had heard the rumours, who knew about the names in the black notebook, who had seen the Pope's growing list of reforms. They didn't say it out loud, but they didn't have to. You could see it in the way they held their rosaries tighter, in how they checked over their shoulders before speaking. They knew the walls had ears now. Maybe they always had. The Curia was split. Some cardinals moved quickly to restore order, to pick a new pope, to pretend everything was normal. Others stayed silent, afraid of choosing the wrong side, because inside the Vatican, the sides were real. Those who wanted change, and those who wanted control. The death of John Paul, I had made one thing clear. The Vatican was not just a church, it was a battlefield. And while incense still filled the halls, and choirs still sang in Latin, there was something darker behind it all. A tension that no prayer could smooth over. People avoided certain rooms, certain people. Some files disappeared, some meetings were cancelled, and always the same message floated beneath it all. Don't ask too many questions. Don't stand out. Don't end up like him. For the faithful outside the walls, the church still stood tall, a symbol of strength, of peace. But inside it was different. Inside there were secrets, and not everyone wanted them kept. What happens to a house built on silence when the silence starts to crack? What happens when the truth is too dangerous to say out loud? Inside the Vatican, after 33 days of light, some rooms had already gone dark. It hadn't even been 6 weeks. The marble floors were still echoing with footsteps from the funeral. The flowers hadn't all wilted. The questions hadn't stopped swirling. But already the doors of the Sistine Chapel closed again. Another conclave, another puff of smoke, another pope. This time the name was Karol Wojtyła, a cardinal from Poland, a country behind the Iron Curtain. A man known for his fierce faith and bold speeches, and just like that he became John Paul II, chosen quickly, announced with smiles, framed as a symbol of strength, a sign that the church was still standing. But for many inside the Vatican it felt rushed, too fast, like a page had been turned before the ink had dried. No one said it out loud, but the silence was loud enough. What was the hurry? Why did it feel like this new pope had already been waiting in the wings? John Paul II was different, not just in origin, but in energy. He was younger, sharper, a former actor turned priest. He commanded attention. He knew how to speak to crowds, how to stir hope in tired hearts. And people listened. They needed something to hold on to, something that didn't look like fear. But in the shadows the questions never stopped. Some whispered that his election was part of a plan, that the death of John Paul, I had cleared the path, that someone somewhere had made sure nothing would stand in the way of the new era. Karol Wojtyła had friends in powerful places. He had studied in Rome, travelled widely, built alliances, and some of those alliances overlapped with the very networks the previous pope had wanted to investigate. Names tied to banks, to secret societies, to movements within the church that didn't like being watched. To the outside world, the message was simple. The church was moving forward, steady, unshaken. But to those who remembered the soft smile of John Paul I, the shift felt like a closing door. One pope had died mysteriously. Another had risen instantly. No time to mourn, no time to dig. Just the pageantry of tradition rolled out once again. Was it divine timing, or was it something else? Some believed John Paul II would carry on the gentle spirit of his predecessor, that his name was a tribute, that reform would live on. But others knew better. They had seen how fast things had vanished, how quickly silence had been enforced. And while the crowds cheered the new pontiff, standing on the balcony, smiling with his arms raised, a few looked up and wondered, what did he already know? And what had he agreed to forget? The calls started softly. A few concerned voices from inside the Vatican. A couple of journalists who refused to drop the story. Some theologians who couldn't accept the official version. They weren't demanding answers with fire and fury. They were just asking questions, reasonable ones. But even those were too much. Why wasn't an autopsy performed? Why did the stories keep changing? Why was the Pope buried so quickly? The Vatican didn't shout back. It didn't need to. Instead, it quietly closed doors, moved people around, changed the subject, and just like that, the questions disappeared from the headlines. Like smoke fading into a sky no one wanted to look at anymore. Inside the church, some bishops asked for clarity. They sent letters. They held hushed conversations in corners of echoing chapels. But most of those efforts never made it past the red tape, or the fear. A few were warned, a few were silenced, and a few simply gave up. Outside the walls, things weren't much better. Italian officials mentioned a potential investigation. They floated the idea of reopening the case, but the pressure came fast. Quiet pressure. Political pressure. And then the idea was gone. Forgotten. Buried. Reporters who had started digging found themselves reassigned. Editors pulled stories without explanation. Witnesses who had been ready to speak suddenly changed their minds. Some said nothing. Some vanished. Some laughed nervously and said it was better not to get involved in Vatican matters. Better for your career, better for your life. There was no official ban on investigating the Pope's death. No statement saying it was forbidden. It didn't have to be. The message was written in the silence, in the cold stares, in the empty offices and unanswered phone calls. Even the ones who believed the Pope had simply died of natural causes started to feel uneasy. Not because they doubted the truth, but because of how hard the Church was working to avoid the conversation. If there was nothing to hide, why did it feel like everything was hidden? Years passed. The memory faded. The world moved on. A new pope smiled from balconies. Wars came and went, but some people never forgot. And the ones who tried to ask again kept running into the same invisible wall. A church that had turned away. A story that had been sealed tight. The Vatican never said no. It just never said anything. And sometimes that kind of silence says more than words ever could. It's the last place you'd expect something like that to happen. Behind the marble columns and golden altars, in a room where the Pope slept beneath a crucifix, a place filled with prayers and candles. But that's exactly what made the whispers louder. If a murder did happen, it wouldn't have needed to be loud. It wouldn't have needed to leave a trace. It only needed to be quiet and fast. Some say it was poison. The old kind. The kind that slips into a cup without a sound. A few drops, no smell, no colour, and suddenly a healthy man becomes a corpse in his bed. There were rumours about digitalis, a drug that slows the heart. Easy to mistake for natural death, especially when no one checks. Others talk about drug substitution. The Pope had been given medicine for low blood pressure. But what if the bottle was switched? What if, instead of helping his heart, it stopped it? Medicine is trust. A doctor hands you something, and you believe it's safe. But what if someone with a different plan got to it first? And then there's the theory that makes people the most uncomfortable. The one that says he didn't die in his sleep at all, that he was silenced in the night. A pillow, a hand, a few seconds of struggle, a quiet end, no noise, no witnesses. Just another morning in the Vatican, with the Pope found still and cold. It sounds extreme, like a scene from a movie. But what makes it eerie is how little we know. How quickly the body was taken away. How no doctor ever saw him officially. How the story changed so many times. Who found him? When they found him, what he was wearing, where the glasses were, where the documents had gone. People who looked closely started to notice things that didn't add up. The Pope had just begun cleaning house. He had a list. He had names. He was going to confront the money trails, the secret societies, the false saints. Maybe he had made promises that scared powerful men. Maybe he had become too dangerous. If you believe the Vatican's version, it was a peaceful death. The Pope simply passed away. No pain, no foul play, just God calling him home. But if you start asking why no one checked, why no one was held accountable, why the evidence vanished, the story starts to feel different. This wasn't just any man. This was the head of the Catholic Church. And he died alone, overnight, with questions that were never answered. Murder in God's house? No one wants to believe it. But the silence around it might be the loudest clue of all. He wasn't like the other men in the Vatican. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus was tall, broad-shouldered, American. Some called him the gorilla. Others just called him dangerous. But behind the jokes was something darker. A man who wasn't just protecting the church's money, he was controlling it, moving it, and maybe even using it for things no one wanted to talk about. Marcinkus ran the Vatican Bank. Officially, it was the Institute for the Works of Religion, a name that sounded holy. But what went on inside that building was anything but. Under Marcinkus, the Vatican Bank started making strange deals, money moving between accounts with no explanation, investments tied to people with criminal records, and partners with names that kept popping up in other scandals. One of those names was Roberto Calvi, an Italian banker known as God's banker. He worked closely with Marcinkus and helped funnel church money through shady channels. But when Calvi's bank started falling apart, the whole network began to crack. Calvi was found dead in London in 1982, hanging under a bridge, pockets stuffed with bricks. The death was first ruled a suicide, then it wasn't. Then there was Michele Sindona, another name tied to both the mafia and the Vatican. Sindona was once trusted with handling millions of the church's funds. He ended up in prison. Poisoned coffee finished him off. Another man connected to Marcinkus, who died with more secrets than answers. People started asking what Marcinkus really knew, how deep his ties went, how much of the church's money had been lost or laundered. Italian prosecutors wanted to question him. They issued warrants. But Marcinkus never faced trial. Why? because he was protected, shielded by the Vatican's walls and its rules. As long as he stayed inside, no one could touch him. The Vatican refused to extradite him. He remained a citizen of a state that didn't play by normal laws. The Pope, who might have challenged him, was already gone. John Paul I had reportedly raised concerns about the Vatican Bank just before his death. Some say he had a list of names. Marcinkus was on it. But the list disappeared, and so did the man who made it. Marcinkus kept his title for years. Even after the scandals, even after billions went missing, he was never charged, never punished. When he eventually retired to the United States, it was in peace. He lived out his days in Arizona, far from the flashing cameras, far from the questions. He died in 2006. But his story never really ended, because the money trail didn't stop, and the Vatican never fully explained how one man could hold so much power over its gold and its silence. Marcinkus may have worn a collar, but to some he was less priest and more banker, and maybe something else entirely. London, 1982. It was early morning when a man walking near the Thames noticed something strange under Blackfriars Bridge. A body hanging by the neck, pockets filled with bricks. And not just anyone. It was Roberto Calvi, once one of the most powerful bankers in Europe, once known as God's banker because of his ties to the Vatican. At first, the death was labelled a suicide. The idea was that Calvi had panicked, that the walls were closing in, that he chose to end it before anyone else could. But almost immediately, the details didn't add up. Bricks in the pockets? That's not how bankers kill themselves. And then there was the location, Blackfriars Bridge, a name that raised eyebrows for people who knew the secret codes. Because Calvi wasn't just a banker. He had connections, deep ones, to men in suits, to cardinals in robes, and to lodges with secret handshakes. He was part of a powerful Masonic group called Propaganda Due, or P2, a group that wasn't supposed to exist, a group that included businessmen, generals, spies, even media moguls. And some said, men in the Vatican too. P2 operated like a shadow government, behind closed doors, pulling strings, making threats, and Calvi was their banker. He helped move money through the Vatican Bank. Money that didn't always come from clean sources, mafia cash, bribes, political funds. And when Calvi's own bank in Italy, Banco Ambrosiano, began to crumble, the entire network started to panic. Documents disappeared. Witnesses went silent, and Calvi fled Italy. He used a fake passport and disappeared into the shadows. Days later, he turned up dead in London. The British police weren't sure what to do. The Italian government stayed quiet. And the Vatican? They said nothing. But the signs were there. Blackfriars. A place name that some believed was a nod to P2, whose members were sometimes called Black Friars. The way Calvi was found, the type of knot used in the hanging, all of it felt ritualistic, like a message, a warning to others. Later investigations would flip the suicide ruling to murder, but by then, most of the trail had gone cold. The Vatican denied any wrongdoing. The money Calvi moved was never fully accounted for, and the people who might have known the full truth were either dead, missing, or very good at staying quiet. Some say Calvi died because he knew too much about the Vatican, about the mafia, about P2. Others believe he was about to talk, that he had threatened to bring the whole system down, and someone made sure he wouldn't get the chance. His death was the final act in a drama that started in Rome, ran through Swiss banks, and ended under a bridge in London. Roberto Calvi, was silenced. But the questions he left behind still echo, and they all lead back to the same place. A place with high walls, locked doors, and secrets buried deeper than any river. There was a secret lodge in Italy that wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't in a church or a palace. It didn't have stained glass windows or public processions. But its members wore suits and collars. Some carried briefcases, others wore crosses. And many had influence far beyond what anyone could see. They called it propaganda due, but most people just knew it as P2. On paper, P2 was a Masonic lodge, a fraternity, but in reality, it was something else. It was a network, a shadow government, a silent hand touching the press, the military, the banks, and even the church. Membership was secret. Meetings were held in private homes or rented apartments. There were no public records, no paper trails, just names on a hidden list and rumours that refused to die. And those names mattered. Generals, politicians, businessmen, judges, media executives, and yes, some said even cardinals. These weren't fringe people, they were insiders. The ones making decisions, the ones shaping narratives, and they were all linked through loyalty to the lodge and to its grandmaster, Liccio Gelli. Gelli was more than a leader. He was a conductor. He moved people like chess pieces. He offered protection, favours, and sometimes threats. He didn't yell or make speeches. He whispered. And people listened. What made P2 so dangerous wasn't just who was in it. It was what they were trying to do. Documents later uncovered suggested they had plans for reshaping Italy itself. They called it the democratic rebirth. But it looked more like a soft coup, a plan to control the media, silence critics, and install loyal men into the highest offices, all while keeping the public unaware. When the lodge was finally exposed in 1981, it was by accident. Police searching Gelli's villa found a list, hundreds of names, and suddenly the whole country realised that P2 wasn't a rumour. It was real. It had been operating for years, right under everyone's noses. The Vatican tried to keep its distance, but some connections were hard to ignore. Calvi, the banker found under Blackfriars Bridge, was linked to P2. Archbishop Marcinkus, who ran the Vatican Bank, was accused of working with men tied to the lodge. And John Paul I, the Pope who vanished after just 33 days, had reportedly made plans to purge Masonic influence from the church. Some believe he had that very list in his possession. Others say he was warned not to act on it. Either way, he died, and the lodge stayed hidden just a little longer. P2 wasn't just a lodge, it was a mirror. It showed how power doesn't always wear a crown or a robe. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in handshakes, in quiet favours, in meetings behind closed doors. And when it's threatened, it protects itself, even if that means rewriting history one silence at a time. There are some letters that were never written, some ideas that never got the chance to become official, but people close to Pope John Paul, I said he had plans, big ones. And if he had lived longer than 33 days, they believe those plans would have changed the church forever. They called them his unwritten encyclicals, not because they were fake, but because they were stopped before they could become real. He had been thinking about them even before he became Pope, quietly, privately, in the margins of notebooks, in whispered conversations with trusted friends, and the topics he wanted to address, they were not safe. One of them had to do with women. Not just allowing them to serve tea or clean the altars. He wanted to recognise their voice, their authority. Some say he was open to the idea of women deacons. Maybe even more. He knew this would shake the foundations, but he also knew the Church had been too quiet for too long when it came to the role of half its people. Another possible encyclical was about money. The Vatican had always been mysterious about its finances, but John Paul I wanted transparency. He believed in the gospel of poverty, not the comfort of hidden accounts. There were whispers that he was planning a financial audit of the Vatican Bank, that he wanted to separate the Church from shady dealings and secret donations, that he wanted sunlight where there had been only shadows. And then there was the idea of decentralization. The Catholic Church had always been top-heavy. Decisions made in Rome affected parishes in Peru or villages in Africa. But Luciani wanted to give more power to the local churches. He believed the people who lived among their communities should have more say, that faith should be local as well as global, that maybe the Vatican shouldn't be the only voice in a world full of believers. These ideas weren't just bold, they were dangerous. To some, they threatened tradition. To others, they threatened control. And to a few in power, they threatened everything they had built. There are no official documents left, no final drafts, but those who knew him said he was writing, or at least thinking about writing, that in the quiet of his room he had begun outlining what could have been a revolution in slow motion, not with fire or fists, but with paper, with words, with a pen. But the pen stopped moving, and the pages remained blank. Today, historians argue over what those encyclicals might have said, what changes they might have inspired. Some say it's all speculation. Others believe the very fact they were never written is proof they were never meant to be. Still, in the silence he left behind, the questions grow louder. What if he had lived? What if he had written them? And what if that was exactly what someone didn't want? Some stories were never told. Others were told once, then swallowed by silence. In the weeks after Pope John Paul I's sudden death, people who had seen something, heard something, or knew too much started to disappear. Not always in the dramatic way people imagine. Sometimes it was just a reassignment, a change of post, a sudden vacation that turned into a permanent transfer. But the message was always the same: be quiet or be gone. There was a nun who claimed to have overheard something in the papal apartments the night before the Pope died. She was moved to a convent across the country, never interviewed, never seen again in public. Her name quietly erased from official rosters, as if she had never been part of the story. A young priest said he saw documents being removed from the papal desk early, before the official discovery of the body. He told a friend who told a journalist. The story was never published. The priest was sent to South America on missionary service within the week. When someone tried to reach him a year later, the contact was blocked. No forwarding address, they were told. Then there were the memoirs. A few insiders tried to write about what happened. A housekeeper, a bishop, even a cardinal. But when the manuscripts were submitted to publishers, strange things started happening. Contracts were cancelled. Editors were replaced. One Vatican insider's entire apartment was reportedly broken into and ransacked. Only one thing was missing: the typed pages of his unfinished book. Whispers grew about how the Vatican had a list of people to watch. Not enemies, exactly, but potential problems. People who knew too much about the last days of John Paul I, or had been too close to his private circle. Some got scared and stopped talking. Others were given new assignments that kept them very far away from Rome. In one case, a Swiss guard was ready to speak about something he had seen during his night shift. He confided in a journalist. They set a date to meet. The guard never showed up. A week later, he was gone, transferred out of the Vatican. Name scrubbed from the records. No reason given. It wasn't always threats. Sometimes it was just a reminder of obedience, a quiet word from a superior, a reminder of vows, of loyalty, of the dangers of scandal. Over time, the noise faded. Reporters moved on. Witnesses aged. Files went missing. And what was left was a puzzle with missing pieces. The kind you can almost see, but never quite finish. And maybe that was the point. In the end, what was more powerful than the truth was the fear of it. And the church knew how to bury fear better than anyone. 33 days. Not 32. Not 34. Just 33. That was the exact length of Pope John Paul I's reign. From the moment he stepped onto the balcony as the smiling surprise pope, to the moment he was found dead in his bed, with his reading glasses still on. A flash of light, then gone. And the number he left behind became its own kind of ghost. To many, it was just coincidence, a short papacy, a tragedy. But to others, it was too perfect, too clean, too strange to ignore. Because 33 isn't just any number. It carries weight across religions, across secret societies, across time. Start with Christianity. Jesus Christ was said to have died at age 33, the age of sacrifice, of transformation, of completing a divine mission. For a pope who wanted to reform the church and bring it back to its roots, dying at the same age as Christ felt eerie, almost poetic, almost like a warning. But then there's the Masonic angle. In Freemasonry, the 33rd degree is the highest level, a symbol of enlightenment, of hidden knowledge, of ultimate power. And in the years that followed John Paul I's death, investigators kept coming back to the same question. Was his death connected to the secret networks of influence he was about to expose? The same networks that included banking elites, political figures, and yes, even Masonic members operating within the church. Some believe the number was chosen on purpose, that it was a message, a signature, not a natural death, but a ritual ending, an execution dressed as fate, a way of saying, we're still in control. We decide how long a pope lasts. Others point to the numerology. In ancient systems of thought, 33 is seen as the number of mastery, the completion of a cycle. In Kabbalah, it holds power. In the occult, it's linked to secret wisdom. Even in architecture, you can find patterns of 33 steps or columns marking sacred places. What does it mean when a man with dreams of cleansing the church just happens to die on day 33? To his supporters, it felt symbolic. Like his life had been cut short at the exact point it started to make change. Like he was ascending towards something higher, only to be stopped by something much older and darker. A force not interested in light, or reform, or mercy. And maybe that's why the number keeps coming back, not just as a date on a calendar, but as a clue, a puzzle piece, a whisper in the silence. Because in a place like the Vatican, nothing is ever just a coincidence. Not smiles, not secrets, and certainly not the number 33. Silence can be peaceful, like the quiet before prayer, or the stillness of a candlelit chapel. But in the case of Pope John Paul I, silence became something else. Not comfort, not respect, but strategy. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of control. From the moment he died, everything went quiet. Too quiet. No alarms, no urgent press releases, just whispers behind closed doors. And within hours, the story had already been shaped. No autopsy, no investigation, just a statement. A heart attack. That was it. A man in good health one day, dead the next, and no one seemed allowed to ask why. But silence in the Vatican has never been about not knowing. It's about not speaking. And when it comes from people in power, silence becomes a kind of weapon. It hides evidence. It buries questions. It protects the ones who might be responsible. John Paul I was a kind man, gentle, honest. He didn't rule like a king. He served like a shepherd. But kindness can be dangerous when it stands in the way of secrets. He wanted to clean up the Vatican Bank. He wanted to name names. He wanted to challenge the system from the inside. And then he died. 33 days in, before he could sign a single reform into law. The people closest to him didn't know what happened. Or if they did, they never said. Reports changed. Timelines shifted. Eyewitnesses were replaced. And the silence grew louder. It echoed through empty corridors. It sank into every gap in the story. It became the new truth. Even the press, usually so hungry for answers, backed away. Some were warned, others were silenced. Journalists who asked the wrong questions found themselves reassigned or ignored. Interviews vanished. Leaks dried up, and the world moved on. But silence isn't empty. It's made of choices. Who gets to speak? What gets remembered? What stays hidden? And in the Vatican, silence can protect centuries of secrets. It can erase mistakes. It can rewrite history without leaving fingerprints. Some say Pope John Paul I was just unlucky, that his death was tragic but natural, that the Church did its best, but others see the silence and hear something else. Not grief, not confusion, but fear. Because when people go quiet all at once, it usually means they know something they can't say, or something they've been told not to say. And when that silence is wrapped around a death, it starts to feel like part of the plan. Pope John Paul I didn't just die, he vanished into silence, a silence built by those who had the most to lose, and maybe the most to hide. Years after his sudden death, the Vatican began something unexpected. They moved to make Pope John Paul I a saint, the man who had reigned for just 33 days, the man whose death raised more questions than answers. Now he was being lifted up as a model of holiness. It seemed like a beautiful gesture, a tribute to his kindness, humility, and faith. But not everyone saw it that way. Some believed it was about more than honouring his life. They saw it as a way to finally seal the story, to wrap it up in gold and glass and make it untouchable. Because once someone becomes a saint, their past is no longer up for debate. You don't question a saint, you venerate them. You stop investigating and start praying. The process of sainthood is slow. It involves interviews, documents, and miracles. But in this case, something felt strange. The Vatican had once avoided even talking about John Paul I's death. Now they were promoting his legacy with full force. Posters, speeches, ceremonies, as if the silence had shifted into celebration, as if sainthood was a new kind of shield. People who had tried for years to get real answers about what happened in 1978 were now being told to move on. Focus on his virtues, not the mystery. Look at his smile, not the night he died. Celebrate the shepherd, forget the shadows. For some, it felt like closure. For others, it felt like a cover. Was he holy? Yes. Was he kind? Without a doubt. But did his path to sainthood conveniently avoid the uncomfortable questions? That's where the unease grew. Some of the very people who had been near him during his final hours were also involved in telling his story now and in shaping his legacy. In the eyes of the Church, canonization can be healing. It reminds the faithful of what goodness looks like. It offers hope. But in the eyes of skeptics, it can also be used to redirect attention, to put a divine seal over something that still doesn't feel fully explained. Even the miracle chosen to support his sainthood, the healing of a young girl, was beautiful. But it had nothing to do with the core mystery, nothing to do with the locked doors, the missing documents, the conflicting stories, the silence that followed his death. Making John Paul I a saint changes how history remembers him. It turns him from a man with unfinished business into a symbol of peace. And once a person becomes a symbol, it becomes harder to ask hard questions about their life or their death. So maybe sainthood is a crown, or maybe it's a lid, one that keeps the past quiet just long enough for people to forget what was really buried underneath. In the official record, Pope John Paul I died of a heart attack in the night. He went to bed with a smile. He was found with his reading glasses still on. Just 33 days after becoming Pope, he was gone. That is the version the world was told. But maybe that's not what really happened. Maybe he didn't just die. Maybe he was erased. Because death is final. Erasure is different. It's a kind of silence that spreads slowly. You don't just remove a person, you remove their words, their plans, their questions. You erase the pages they were writing, the reforms they were starting, the voices they were listening to. You leave only the part of them that is easy to explain, the kind smile, the short reign, the saint. But people remember, not always the facts, but the feeling that something wasn't right, that something still lingers in the walls of the Vatican, that behind the marble, the incense, and the Latin prayers, there was a man who wanted to change things. And maybe that's why he vanished. He didn't wear the crown. He didn't follow the script. He laughed too much. He asked too many questions. He trusted too openly. And then one night, the world was told he was gone. No autopsy. No warning. No clear answers. Just a funeral. A new pope, and a church that moved on like it had rehearsed this before. There's a kind of silence in the Vatican that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like a locked door, like a name scratched off a list, like whispers in marble hallways that grow quiet when someone walks by. John Paul I was supposed to be a bridge, a healer, a light in the middle of dark times. But light makes shadows nervous, and some shadows have power. They buried his body. But they buried more than that. They buried what he was trying to do, what he saw, what he said, behind closed doors, the notebook on his desk, the names circled in red, the late-night meetings, the strange warnings, the people who were suddenly transferred or silenced, all of it locked away, as if he had never existed. But erasure is never perfect. There are always cracks, a missing page, a name that won't go away, a photograph someone forgot to burn. And in those cracks, he still exists. In the questions no one answered. In the eyes of Sister Vincenza. In the silence of the doctor who was never called. In the flicker of doubt behind the smiles at his canonization. Pope John Paul I didn't just vanish from life, he vanished from history. Or someone tried to make it look that way. But the truth has a strange way of surviving. It waits. It lingers. And sometimes it whispers through the walls of the most sacred places. He was the Pope who vanished. But maybe, just maybe, he's still here, in the silence they couldn't quite kill.